He was one of the richest men in the country, but no amount of money could fix what truly mattered. After firing 7 maids in just 1 month, desperate to help his non-verbal autistic son who lived in fear and silence. Since losing his mother, this billionaire was ready to give up until a quiet housekeeper with a painful past did what no therapist could. What happened next broke him completely. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Walters had everything a person could want. Money, power, a company that dominated the pharmaceutical industry. But none of it mattered when he was at home, looking at his 5-year-old son, Ethan. Since the day his wife died, Ethan hadn't said a single word. Richard remembered the boy's laughter, the sound of his voice. It all disappeared after her funeral. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't respond to his name. He didn't look anyone in the eye. Doctors said he had severe autism. Richard didn't fully understand what that meant at first. He thought maybe Ethan was just grieving, but weeks turned into months, and it became clear his son was locked inside a world Richard couldn't enter. The boy screamed if anyone tried to hug him. He panicked under bright lights. He stared for hours at walls or at nothing at all. Richard had never felt so powerless in his life, not even in the most ruthless boardroom battles. The Walters mansion was massive, quiet, and cold. Staff moved carefully through its halls, especially around Ethan. 7 caretakers had come and gone in a single month. They tried their best, but each one left quickly, either burned out, overwhelmed, or fired. Richard had a short temper when it came to his son. He couldn't stand the sound of Ethan crying. He couldn't bear watching him flinch away from every hand, every voice. He yelled at the caretakers, blaming them for not trying hard enough, but a part of him knew they weren't the problem. Every time a new expert failed, a tiny part of Richard broke inside. He would watch Ethan from a distance, afraid to get too close. His son didn't recognize him, not really. And that thought kept him awake at night. Richard had faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar lawsuits, and political attacks. None of them shook him the way Ethan's blank stare did. Every night after the staff went to bed, Richard wandered the house like someone looking for something lost. He walked past Ethan's door and paused, listening. The boy didn't cry anymore. He made no sounds at all. It was the silence that hurt the most. Richard used to imagine his son dreaming, maybe having good dreams. But now he feared there was nothing in Ethan's world except fear and darkness. Sometimes he stood outside the boy's room for hours. Other times he went to his office, poured himself a drink, and stared at old photos. Ethan as a baby, his wife smiling, all the things he could never get back. He kept asking himself where things had gone wrong. Was it the business trips? The late nights? Did Ethan blame him for her death? Richard didn't have the answers. All he had were regrets and a growing fear that time was running out. Doctors had offered every solution in the book: behavioral therapy, speech therapy, even experimental treatments. Richard paid for all of it: top professionals, custom programs, in-home sessions. None of it worked. Therapists left with tired eyes and hopeless words. They said progress would be slow, but Richard wasn't wired for patience. He expected results. What he got instead was silence. Ethan wouldn't look at the therapists, wouldn't respond to toys, games, or music. Sometimes he screamed at nothing. Sometimes he spun in circles until he fell. Richard sat in on one session and had to leave halfway through. He couldn't take it. He went into his office and slammed the door, furious at everyone, and mostly at himself. He couldn't fix his own child. His money, his power, his connections, none of it made a difference. All he wanted was for Ethan to say one word. Even just Dad. Special lights were installed because Ethan couldn't handle normal ones. Soundproofing was added to his room so his episodes wouldn't echo through the halls. A therapist suggested using visual schedules and picture boards, but Ethan tore them up or ignored them completely. Meals were a challenge. He wouldn't eat if the food was the wrong color or texture. Bath time was a nightmare. Richard had to hire 2 aides just to manage it. And yet, in the middle of all this, Richard still hoped. Some part of him believed that if he just tried harder, spent more, something would change. But each day that passed, with no sign of recognition from Ethan, felt like another door closing. Richard stopped going into the city. He let others run the company. His life had shrunk down to that house, to that boy, and to the growing fear that his presence might be doing more harm than good. The worst moment came one morning, early, when Richard tried something simple. He brought Ethan a toy car, one he used to love. He sat beside him on the carpet and rolled it forward. "Look, buddy," he said softly. Ethan didn't move. Richard tried again, even made a little engine sound. Ethan blinked slowly but didn't even glance at the car. Then, without warning, he shrieked and covered his ears. Richard backed away, stunned. He placed the toy down and left the room quietly. Later that night, he sat alone in the dark, thinking. There had to be something left to try. But what if there wasn't? What if this was it? A son who didn't know him, a father who couldn't reach him. That thought was the heaviest of all, that one day Ethan might not remember him at all, and even worse, maybe he never really had. Grace Miller arrived at the Walters mansion early in the morning. A staff member met her at the side entrance and showed her around quickly. The house was huge, filled with expensive furniture and quiet hallways. Grace didn't react much. She kept her head down, nodded when spoken to, and asked no questions. Her job was simple: cleaning, laundry, organizing. No interaction with the child, no personal conversations with Mr. Walters, and no mention of her past. That was exactly how she wanted it. She had been many things in her life: nurse, counselor, mother. But here she was just the housekeeper. She had asked for the job under a different name. Grace Miller wasn't the name on her birth certificate, but it was the one she used now. She didn't want to be recognized. Not after everything that happened at the clinic, not after what happened in court. She just needed a chance to breathe, to disappear, to begin again. On her first day, she worked quietly and stayed out of the way. Most of the staff avoided speaking too much, except for a cook who gave her a short list of cleaning tasks. Grace moved from room to room with her cleaning cart, wiping windows, dusting bookshelves, folding towels. Around midday, while cleaning the large living room, she noticed movement behind the long velvet curtains. She paused, then continued sweeping. From the corner of her eye, she saw a small figure, Ethan. He was clutching a worn-out plush horse, his fingers rubbing the fabric over and over. He didn't look at her, and she didn't try to speak. She knew better. Instead, she continued sweeping, slowly and calmly, humming a soft tune her grandmother used to sing when Grace was little. It wasn't for him. Not directly, but maybe it could be. She didn't look back, didn't say a word, just kept doing her work like he wasn't even there. The next day was the same. Grace cleaned the hallways, organized cabinets, mopped the floors. She passed Ethan once in the upstairs corridor. He was sitting with his back against the wall, legs tucked in, eyes focused on a spot in the distance. His stuffed horse sat in his lap. Grace gave a small nod, but didn't say anything. She didn't stop walking. No sudden moves, no loud voice. In the kitchen, she helped wash the dishes. At one point, she noticed a cup of warm milk sitting untouched on the counter. She asked the cook if it was for Ethan. "He never drinks it," the cook said. "We just offer, every day." Grace took mental note of that. Later that evening, as she finished wiping the dining table, she quietly poured a fresh cup of milk. She placed it on the floor, near the hallway where she had last seen him. Then she left without looking back. She said nothing. By the third day, something had changed. Grace was sweeping near the kitchen again when she noticed Ethan sitting just outside the doorway. He wasn't hidden this time. He sat with his back against the wall, his toy horse in one hand, and his eyes fixed on her. He didn't look afraid. He just stared. Grace didn't react. She kept sweeping and started humming again, that same lullaby. She didn't try to speak to him or make eye contact. She just worked. After a while, she poured another cup of milk and placed it on the floor near where he sat. She went on cleaning and left the kitchen for a while to work in another room. When she returned, the cup was empty. She didn't mention it to anyone. She didn't smile or celebrate. But inside, she felt something shift. It wasn't much, but for a boy who didn't let anyone near, it was everything. Grace didn't try to do more than what she had already done. She stuck to her chores. She cleaned the bathrooms, dusted the picture frames in the hallway, folded laundry, and helped the cook prepare meals. She still saw Ethan around the house, usually sitting alone, sometimes behind furniture or under tables. He always had his plush horse with him, but now, whenever Grace walked by, he would look at her, just a glance. But it was enough. She didn't force any connection. She let him come to her in his own way. Each day, she left a small cup of milk near where she guessed he might be. Some days, the cup stayed full. Other days, it was empty when she came back. Grace didn't change her routine. She never spoke to him. She just worked, kept humming softly, and made sure the cup was always there. Quiet gestures, no pressure. That's what Ethan seemed to need. In the evenings, after the house settled down and the other staff left for the night, Grace sat in the laundry room for a while, folding the last batch of clothes. She thought about her old life sometimes, about Veronica Hale. That name still hurt. She had once worked with children, troubled children. She had believed in healing, in reaching them, but one mistake, one accusation, and everything was gone. Her job, her license, her daughter. She had lost custody after the scandal, and she hadn't seen her girl in years. Now she was here, in a house full of silence, trying to rebuild from nothing. She hadn't planned to meet a boy like Ethan. But maybe this was her second chance. Not to fix him, not to be his therapist, just to be someone who stayed, someone who didn't give up after one day. As she cleaned the kitchen floor that night, she noticed the milk cup was empty again, and that was everything. Rain fell steadily outside, tapping against the windows of the large mansion. The sky was grey, and the day had been long. Grace had spent hours cleaning, folding sheets, organizing cupboards and wiping floors. Her arms ached, and her legs felt heavy. After dinner, with the house quiet and most of the staff gone, she made her way to the living room. The fireplace was off, but the thick rug on the floor felt soft and warm. She sat down slowly, stretched her legs out, and finally lay back, letting her body relax. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. The silence was peaceful. She wasn't thinking about work or memories, or even Ethan. She just needed a break from everything. Her breathing slowed, and her thoughts drifted. She didn't hear any footsteps. She didn't realize anyone was near. But then, something light touched her chest. It was soft, careful, like a whisper made of plastic and trust. Grace's eyes opened slowly. She didn't move right away. A small plastic stethoscope rested on her chest, the kind that came from toy medical kits. A child's toy. Standing over her was Ethan, his face serious and focused. His hand held the other end of the stethoscope as if he were truly listening. Grace looked into his eyes, and for the first time he looked right back. No fear, no panic, just connection. Then, without warning, Ethan spoke. His voice was small and quiet, but the words were clear. "I will heal you, Mommy," he whispered. Grace's heart skipped. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She barely breathed. He had called her Mommy. He had spoken at all. It didn't make sense, and yet in that moment it didn't need to. Ethan was kneeling beside her, present, engaged, and alive in a way no one had seen before. Grace could only watch, frozen by the miracle unfolding in front of her. Just then, the door to the living room opened. Richard Walters stepped inside, expecting to see an empty space or maybe a quiet staff member finishing work. Instead, he saw his son kneeling beside Grace, holding a plastic toy. Ethan didn't notice his father. He was focused completely on the woman lying on the floor. Richard stopped walking. He didn't speak. His eyes locked onto his son, then onto Grace. He saw the stethoscope. He saw the boy's calm expression. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable. "I will heal you, Mommy." The words echoed in his head. It hit him like a wave. His son had spoken. The boy who hadn't said anything for years had just whispered a full sentence. And he hadn't spoken to Richard. He had spoken to her, to the housekeeper. Richard's mind raced. He felt confusion, rage, grief, jealousy, and something else he couldn't explain. This wasn't how healing was supposed to happen. Richard took a step back, unsure of what to do. He felt powerless, watching something he couldn't control. For years, he had hired the best therapists, speech specialists, and behavioral experts. Nothing had worked. He had spent money, time, and energy trying to fix his son. And now, after just days, Grace had reached him. But she wasn't a doctor. She wasn't trained. She didn't follow the plans. She didn't report progress in meetings or write reports. She just cleaned, and yet Ethan had connected with her. Richard didn't know whether to be angry or grateful. A part of him felt betrayed, like someone had taken something from him. Another part wanted to fall to his knees in relief. He stood there in silence, watching. Grace didn't speak. She looked up at Richard, unsure of what would happen next. Ethan gently pressed the stethoscope to her chest again, completely unaware of the storm happening just a few feet away. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep and the house was quiet again, Richard sat alone in his private study. The lights were low, and the rain outside had not stopped. On the desk in front of him was a framed photo, his wife, smiling, holding Ethan as a baby. It had been taken in the backyard on a warm day. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. Richard stared at the photo for a long time, saying nothing. His thoughts were messy. He wanted to believe this moment with Ethan was the beginning of something good, but it was complicated. Why Grace? Why now? Was it luck, fate, or something else? He had tried everything and failed, and this woman, this stranger, had walked into their lives and done the impossible. Richard didn't know how to feel. His chest hurt in a way he didn't expect. Quietly, he began to cry. Slow tears, no sound. Oh. The photo in his hands blurred through the tears. Richard touched his wife's face in the picture with his thumb. He remembered her voice, her laughter, the way she used to calm Ethan during his earliest meltdowns. She would sing or rock him gently. He remembered thinking he'd never be able to do what she did, and after she died, he never could. That night, sitting in the dark, he understood something clearly for the first time. Ethan didn't need perfect systems. He didn't need structured programs or expensive therapy rooms. He needed someone who saw him, really saw him, someone who didn't ask anything from him. Grace had been that person. Without meaning to, she had filled a space that had been empty for a long time. Richard wept, not because of failure, but because of a strange, painful hope. For the first time in years, it felt like maybe his son was still in there. Maybe. Richard sat in his study late into the night, the glow of his laptop screen lighting his face as he scrolled through pages of documents. His curiosity about Grace had turned into concern. Something didn't sit right with him. She had entered their lives suddenly. No references, no formal vetting, just a quiet woman who managed to reach his son in a way no professional ever had. But Richard was not a man who trusted easily, especially not with something as fragile as Ethan. He started pulling up records, digging deeper. It didn't take long before he found what he didn't want to see. Years ago, Grace had been a nurse at a respected pediatric clinic. She had worked closely with children, but her file ended in scandal. Fired, investigated. A custody case followed, and she had lost her daughter. The judge's ruling mentioned negligence, and the person behind her dismissal? Veronica Hale, Richard's own trusted advisor. That changed everything. The next morning, Richard met with Veronica in his office. She had always been clear and professional, her opinions sharp and direct. When he brought up Grace, she didn't hesitate. "She's dangerous," Veronica said, folding her arms. "I warned you about her before you hired her. She's unstable. She makes emotional decisions and crosses boundaries. That's not someone you want around your child." Richard pressed for details. Veronica explained how Grace had formed inappropriate emotional attachments to patients, how she ignored protocol, and how one of her choices had nearly led to a serious incident. "She lost custody of her own child," Veronica added. "That should tell you enough." Richard felt sick. His mind replayed Ethan's words, the stethoscope, the silence broken. And now, this. He needed answers. He needed to face Grace. When he found her folding towels in the laundry room, he asked straight out. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her voice was calm. "Ask Ethan if I'm dangerous," she said. Richard didn't respond right away. He stared at her, looking for any sign of a lie, anything in her expression that matched what the reports had said. But there was nothing. Just a quiet woman, tired but steady, standing in front of him with nothing to hide. Part of him wanted to believe her. Deep down, he already did. But the other part, the side trained by years of business, politics, and caution, kept repeating Veronica's words. Headlines don't lie. Court documents don't lie. The risk was real. Still, something about Grace's answer stuck with him. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain or argue. She didn't beg. She let Ethan speak for her, even in her absence. That choice said something, but Richard felt cornered. He had advisors, a reputation, and a fragile son to protect. If anything went wrong under his roof, it would be his fault. That night, after long hesitation, he made the decision. Grace had to go. The next day, Richard called her into the kitchen. His words were clipped, businesslike. "You've done good work here, but this arrangement can't continue." Grace nodded once. She didn't ask why. She didn't fight. She packed her things quietly and left through the back door. Ethan was in the hallway when she passed. He stood still, watching her with wide eyes. Grace looked at him but didn't speak. She gave him a small wave, and then she was gone. That evening, the house felt strange. Too still. Too cold. At dinner, Ethan refused to sit. He pushed away his food and curled into a corner. The staff tried to coax him, but he screamed. Richard came to him, tried to speak softly, but Ethan flinched and hit his own head against the wall, over and over. Richard called for help. Nothing worked. Not the medication, not the routine, nothing. He sat helpless on the floor, watching his son fall apart. Hours passed, and Ethan's crying didn't stop. His voice grew hoarse, but he kept screaming, thrashing, refusing to be touched. Richard paced the room, calling doctors, begging for solutions. One suggested increasing the dosage of a sedative. Another recommended restraint. None of it helped. Every time someone approached, Ethan reacted worse. His body trembled with panic. Richard finally ordered everyone out of the room and sat by the door, head in his hands. The house was full of staff, but no one knew what to do. For years, they had relied on experts. For weeks, they had relied on Grace, and now she was gone, sent away because of what might have been. Richard began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe the reports were true. Maybe she had a troubled past. But here, in this house in Ethan's small world, she had done no harm. In fact, she had brought something they hadn't seen in years. Peace. Richard stayed awake all night. He sat by Ethan's bed, watching his son twitch in broken sleep. Bruises were forming on the boy's forehead from where he had hit the wall. Richard felt powerless. More than that, he felt regret. He had relied on paper, background checks, warnings and resumes. But none of those had reached Ethan. Only Grace had. She didn't come with promises. She didn't offer plans, but she had been there in the silence where no one else could stay. He understood now. Trust isn't built by credentials. It's felt. In quiet moments, in stillness, in patience. He thought about her voice, the way she never forced anything, the way Ethan had looked at her like she mattered, and now she was gone. Ethan's world had collapsed because of it. Richard knew then that he couldn't fix this with money or power. He had to do the hardest thing of all, admit he was wrong, and maybe find a way to bring her back. While dusting the bookshelves in Richard's private study, Grace moved a few old children's books aside. Some were picture books with bent corners and faded covers, clearly once favorites of Ethan's. As she wiped the shelves, her cloth caught the edge of something tucked behind the row. Curious, she reached in and pulled out a yellowed, sealed envelope covered in dust. It had no stamp or address, just a handwritten label in black ink. Ethan, initial eval. Her eyes lingered on it for a few seconds. It didn't look like something meant to be lost. She opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the papers inside. They were medical documents full of clinical terms and observations. But one phrase stood out immediately: sensory processing disorder, not autism. The recommendation was clear. Grace read the full report, line by line. At the bottom, she found a familiar name, Dr. Joseph Lang. That name had never come up in any discussions about Ethan's condition before. Grace sat down at the edge of the desk, still holding the report. She remembered Richard mentioning how many experts had seen Ethan, how so many had given up. But Dr. Lang's report was different. It didn't focus on social detachment or speech delay. Instead, it described a child who became overwhelmed by sound, light, and touch. It outlined therapies that were sensory-focused, not behavioral. Grace read the date. It had been written years ago, before Ethan completely stopped speaking. Her hands began to shake slightly. Why hadn't anyone ever mentioned this? Why wasn't this part of Ethan's official file? Then, she noticed a page stapled to the back. It was a recommendation for follow-up care, with a note at the bottom, forwarded to Ms. Hale. Grace's stomach turned. Veronica Hale. The same woman who had gotten her fired, who had testified against her in court, and who had convinced Richard to send her away. This wasn't just an accident. This was deliberate. The next morning, Grace asked for a short meeting with Ethan's current therapist. She brought the report with her, unsure how it would be received. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Collins, read the pages slowly and carefully. She didn't speak right away, but her expression changed as she flipped through each section. "This actually makes a lot of sense," she finally said. "This explains Ethan's reactions to touch and sound better than a classic autism diagnosis. They overlap, yes, but this is closer to what we're actually seeing." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Dr. Collins agreed to make notes in Ethan's current file and said she would bring it up with Richard. Grace nodded, but deep down, she knew this wasn't going to be simple. She had seen what Veronica was capable of. If she had buried this once, she would do it again. Only now, Grace wasn't afraid. Grace spent the rest of the day in silence. She didn't bring it up with anyone else, not yet. She walked through the house, doing her tasks as usual, but her mind was racing. She knew what this report meant. It wasn't just a medical difference, it was a decision that had changed Ethan's entire life. If he had been treated for sensory processing disorder from the start, everything might have been different. The screaming, the shutdowns, the isolation. They could have been managed another way. And more than that, Grace realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice someone made to ignore the truth. Veronica had taken Grace's daughter, her career, her reputation. And now it looked like she had taken Ethan's future too. Grace wasn't angry for herself. That part of her had hardened a long time ago. But she felt something new now, a need to protect Ethan, to fight for him, like no one else had. That night, Grace sat at the edge of Ethan's bed while he slept. He was curled under his blanket, holding his stuffed horse close to his chest. His breathing was steady, his face calm. She brushed a bit of hair from his forehead and whispered softly, "I won't let them hurt you again." She meant it. She was no longer just a housekeeper or a woman trying to rebuild her life. She had become something else in this house, something more important. Grace knew going up against Veronica meant risk. She might lose everything again, but she didn't care. If she stayed quiet, nothing would change. She had let fear silence her once before. This time she would speak, even if no one wanted to hear it, even if it cost her the second chance she had found here. Because now it wasn't just her story, it was Ethan's, and he had already lost too much. Grace held onto the report tightly that night, locking it in her small suitcase beneath the bed. She couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to the day Ethan had spoken. "I will heal you, Mommy." It hadn't just been a child's game. It had been a message. He had trusted her. He had reached out when everyone else had given up. Grace wasn't going to let that moment disappear. She thought about every setback, every false diagnosis, every adult who had looked at Ethan and seen only a problem to manage. He deserved better. The next morning, she planned to speak with Richard. Not just about the report, but about everything. Veronica, the lies, the consequences. She didn't expect him to believe her right away, but she needed to try, because Ethan had whispered to her when the world said he couldn't speak. That wasn't a mistake. That was proof. And Grace was ready to fight for it, no matter what came next. Richard didn't tell anyone about the appointment except Grace. He didn't want press. He didn't want Veronica involved. He didn't even use his assistant. He called Dr. Lang directly after midnight, leaving a message with his real name. The next morning, the doctor returned the call. His voice was calm and measured, not surprised to hear from Richard after all these years. Dr. Lang had retired from big hospitals and now ran a small private office in a quiet Vermont town. He didn't advertise. He took a handful of cases a year. "I remember Ethan," he said. "I always wondered what happened after my report was ignored." Richard paused. "We want to know the truth now." Grace stood nearby during the call, listening, waiting. When Richard ended the conversation, she spoke without hesitation. "I'm coming with you." He nodded. He didn't argue. He couldn't. For this, he needed her. For Ethan, she was already the one person who mattered. They left early 2 days later. The drive was supposed to be 6 hours, maybe less with light traffic. Grace packed snacks, headphones, sensory toys, and Ethan's stuffed horse. Richard drove, hands tense on the wheel. Ethan sat in the back, silent at first, staring out the window. About halfway through the trip, they stopped at a rest area. Ethan had seemed calm until the moment they got out of the car. Then something triggered him. Maybe the echo of a hand dryer inside the bathroom. Maybe the sudden noise of a truck pulling in. He dropped to the ground, covering his ears, screaming loudly. People stared. Richard froze. He reached forward but didn't know what to do. Grace didn't hesitate. She crawled under a picnic table with Ethan, gently pulled him into her lap, and began humming softly. Not speaking, just humming. Ethan cried into her shirt for 10 minutes, body shaking. Slowly, his breathing slowed. His grip loosened. She kept humming. Richard watched from a few feet away, completely still. He had never seen someone calm Ethan like that, not in public, not in chaos. He felt useless, like he didn't belong in that moment. When the boy finally relaxed, Grace kissed the top of his head and whispered, "We're okay now." Ethan didn't speak, but leaned into her shoulder. They stayed like that under the table for a while longer until he was ready to move. Richard helped them back into the car, but the rest of the drive was quiet. Everyone was tired. Ethan eventually fell asleep with his head on Grace's leg. When they arrived at the clinic, it was a small white building near the woods, simple and quiet. It didn't look like a place for miracles, but Richard hoped it could at least offer answers. Dr. Lang greeted them at the door. He was older now, grey and slow-moving, but his eyes were sharp, aware, and kind. Inside the consultation room, there were no machines, no large desks or intimidating lights. Just a couch, 2 chairs, and a few shelves with toys and puzzles. Ethan walked around the room on his own, picking up a toy block, then placing it down again. He didn't speak, he didn't sit, but he didn't scream either. Dr. Lang watched him silently, making no sudden moves. Grace sat on the floor, giving Ethan space but remaining near. Richard stood by the wall, arms crossed tightly. After 20 minutes of observation, Dr. Lang began asking questions, not to Ethan, but to Grace and Richard, about behavior, about reactions to noise, food, touch. He took notes, asked more. Then, after nearly an hour, he closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "He does not have severe autism," he said plainly. "This is not classic autism. This is a sensory and emotional disorder. With the right tools and consistent emotional support, he can improve significantly." Richard sat down slowly, his hands gripping his knees. His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything for a long time. Grace didn't interrupt. She looked at Ethan, who was lining up colored blocks quietly. The doctor continued, "Your son's biggest challenges come from how his brain processes the world. He's overwhelmed, not disconnected. That's why trust changes him, why silence helps, why routine alone didn't work." Richard finally spoke. His voice cracked slightly. "They told me I had no choice, that this was permanent." Dr. Lang looked at him. They were wrong. Or they didn't care enough to look closer. Richard nodded slowly. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. Years of effort, money, pushing through doors that led nowhere, all based on a diagnosis that wasn't entirely true. Grace reached over and gently touched his arm. "You have one now," she said quietly. "A choice." Richard looked at her, then at Ethan, and he believed her. On the drive back, no one spoke for the first hour. Ethan slept. Grace stared out the window, thinking. Richard drove, but he wasn't thinking about the road. He was thinking about how different everything could have been. All the therapists, all the money, all the fear. None of it had reached Ethan the way Grace had. He thought about Veronica, about the buried report, about the lies that had shaped his son's life. The truth was hard. It hurt. But it also gave him something he hadn't had in a long time: direction. When they pulled into a small diner for dinner, Ethan didn't scream. He sat beside Grace and ate quietly, one piece of bread at a time. Richard watched him, still unsure how this was all real. But it was. That night, back at the mansion, Richard didn't go to his study. He sat outside Ethan's room and listened, not for cries, but for quiet. And in that silence, he heard hope. The attack came without warning. One morning, Richard opened his tablet to check emails and instead found news alerts flashing across the screen. Headlines from multiple outlets filled the homepage. Disgraced woman back in child's life. Custody battle meltdown resurfaces. And Grace Miller or Veronica Hale? Who should Richard Walters trust? Attached to the articles was video footage, shaky, grainy, clearly pulled from court archives. It showed Grace sobbing uncontrollably during a custody hearing years ago. shouting at an unseen lawyer and being escorted out by bailiffs. The article below twisted the event to paint her as unstable, dangerous, unfit to be around any child. To make it worse, doctored documents were shared, files that claimed she had been under psychiatric watch. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. It was a full-blown smear campaign, and the source of the leak? Veronica Hale. She hadn't even tried to hide it. It was a brutal, calculated strike. And it worked fast. Within 24 hours, Child Protective Services contacted Richard directly. They had received multiple reports expressing concern about Ethan's safety due to Grace's presence in the home. A formal investigation was opened. Richard pushed back, tried to explain the situation, but the agency followed protocol. Until the inquiry was resolved, Grace had to be removed from the house. 2 officials came to escort her out. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. Grace only looked at Ethan, who was sitting on the floor hugging his plush horse. When the door closed behind her, he didn't react at first. But by nightfall, everything changed. Ethan refused food. He sat in one spot for hours, rocking back and forth. When Richard tried to comfort him, the boy screamed, thrashed, and clawed at the door. Over and over, he cried one word, "Mommy!" until his voice was raw. Nothing calmed him, not medicine, not Richard's arms, not silence. Without Grace, Ethan began to fall apart. Richard tried everything. He called doctors, therapists, even brought back a specialist who hadn't seen Ethan in over a year, but nothing helped. The boy wouldn't sleep through the night. He hit his head against the wall. He refused to drink, refused to be touched. His regression was fast and severe. Richard sat outside Ethan's room night after night, listening to the cries. He tried holding the boy, reading to him, replaying Grace's old lullabies from his phone. Ethan would only scream louder. One night, Richard broke down in the hallway, his head in his hands. He thought about what Veronica had said when she called, "You can't save a child with a broken woman." But now, he knew the truth. Grace wasn't the problem. Grace was the answer. Ethan hadn't just improved with her. He had come alive. Richard's mistake hadn't been hiring her. It had been letting her go, and now he couldn't ignore that truth anymore. Veronica continued her campaign. She sent statements to the press, praising CPS for swift intervention. She met with board members, spun her story about protecting Ethan from a manipulative ex-employee with a dangerous past. Richard didn't say anything publicly, not yet, but he began working behind the scenes. He reached out to former families who had worked with Veronica. Some were hesitant at first, others hung up, but eventually people began to talk. One mother described how her child was misdiagnosed and placed on unnecessary medication for years. Another father explained how his wife had been threatened with legal action when they challenged Veronica's treatment plans. One nurse shared how she had been fired after questioning a report. As the stories added up, Richard saw the pattern. Veronica had built a system based on control and silence. Those who obeyed her stayed. Those who resisted were discredited, and Grace hadn't just resisted, she had exposed the cracks. Richard kept gathering evidence. He hired an independent investigator to trace the altered documents used against Grace. The forgery was obvious to a professional eye: metadata mismatches, inconsistent signatures, dates that didn't align. He met with legal advisors to see how the false information had slipped through the system. Each step brought more proof of manipulation. But this wasn't just about clearing Grace's name anymore. Richard felt something deeper, a need to make it right, not just for Ethan, but for every child Veronica had misled, every parent she had silenced. He began preparing a full report, collecting testimonies, records, and financial statements. His legal team warned him that taking down Veronica would be messy. She had powerful friends, but Richard didn't care. He had been blind for too long, letting her operate under his protection. That was over. Now she would face the truth. He would make sure of it, even if it cost him everything. The mansion no longer felt like a home. Richard walked through the halls in silence, hearing echoes of Ethan's cries. The boy hardly spoke now. He spent most of his days curled up in corners, refusing food, sometimes just whispering "mommy" to himself. Grace called once, just to check in, but CPS had warned her not to contact the family during the review. She didn't ask for updates. She only said, "Tell him I'm not gone." Richard promised he would. That night, he sat in Ethan's room watching his son sleep with dark circles under his eyes and bruises on his arms from his own fists. Richard looked out the window and made a vow. Veronica had taken enough. She had lied, manipulated, destroyed lives. And now her time was up. He wasn't going to stop until every truth she buried was pulled into the light. Grace had fought alone for too long. Now it was his turn. Grace sat alone in a small guest house hours away from the Walters mansion. She hadn't heard Ethan's voice in days, not since CPS had removed her. Her hands trembled as she held her phone. For weeks, she had held on to something she hoped she'd never have to use. It was her last piece of proof. One night, after the custody battle, Veronica had left a voicemail on Grace's phone. Back then, Grace had saved it without knowing why, maybe instinct, maybe fear. Now it was all she had left. She pressed play again just to make sure. The message was short but full of venom. Veronica's voice was sharp, cold, and full of threat. "You speak, and I'll ruin you again." There was no mistaking who it was, no excuse for the words. Grace took a deep breath, scrolled to Richard's number, and hit send. When he answered, she didn't explain. She just forwarded the voicemail and said, "Play it." His hands clenched into fists by the time it ended. He sat still, playing it back twice to be sure. There was no doubt. It was Veronica. And it wasn't just unprofessional. It was a threat, a clear act of intimidation. He sent it to his legal team without hesitation. The lawyers responded within the hour. This changes everything. Within days, they filed a motion to reopen the investigation using the voicemail as key evidence. What followed moved faster than anyone expected. The court approved a hearing, and the trial was scheduled. News spread quickly. Families who had once been silent came forward. Several agreed to testify. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Veronica sat in the defendant's chair, composed at first, but her eyes flickered each time new witnesses took the stand. Grace sat quietly beside her attorney. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had nothing left to lose. One by one, families spoke. A mother described being pressured to put her daughter on medication she didn't need. A former nurse described how reports were edited before being submitted. A father shared how his child was denied alternative diagnoses and forced into a treatment plan that made everything worse. Then came the audio recordings. A former staff member had saved phone calls, voicemails, even meeting recordings. Veronica's voice was heard instructing her staff to stick with the autism diagnosis, don't confuse the parents. Another clip played her saying, "Make them believe it's permanent. They'll spend more." Gasps filled the room. Veronica's calm began to break. Her lawyers tried to object, tried to reframe it, but the evidence kept piling up. Then Richard took the stand. His hands shook as he held his written statement. He looked at the judge, then at Grace, then at the gallery. "My son was labeled broken so someone could profit," he said. "That ends today." The judge reviewed the evidence carefully over the next few days. Meanwhile, Veronica's team struggled to recover. More documents surfaced, notes showing altered evaluations, emails threatening staff into silence. Grace stayed quiet throughout most of it. She didn't need to speak. The truth was speaking loud enough now. When the verdict was read, the judge's voice was firm and clear. Grace was fully cleared. Veronica was found guilty of professional misconduct and fraud. Charges were recommended for further investigation. The courtroom didn't cheer. It didn't need to. Justice had finally spoken. After the trial, Grace stepped outside and breathed deeply. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired, but she was free. More importantly, Ethan would be free. Richard came out after her, holding a simple envelope. Inside was a letter from the court confirming Grace was allowed back in the house. No restrictions. She took it with both hands and held it close. That evening, Grace returned to the mansion. She stepped through the front door slowly, unsure of what she would find. But she didn't have to wait long. From the top of the stairs, Ethan appeared. He looked different, thinner, quieter, with dark circles under his eyes. For a second, he just stared at her. Then he ran. His small feet hit the floor fast as he rushed into her arms, tears falling down his cheeks. "You came back," he whispered again and again. Grace held him tightly, her arms wrapped fully around him. Richard stood nearby, watching with wet eyes. Then, for the first time, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around both of them. It wasn't forced. It wasn't planned. It just happened. A real moment, honest and full of everything they had survived. They had lost time. They had lost peace. But now, together, they were beginning to heal. The silence was over. Richard watched Ethan closely that night as the boy ate half a meal for the first time in days. Grace sat beside him, humming softly. Ethan leaned against her shoulder like nothing had ever changed. But everything had. Richard felt different, lighter, stronger. For years, he had believed what people told him. He followed diagnoses, signed checks, followed plans that never worked. But now, he knew better. He had learned the hardest way that silence can speak and fear can lie. Ethan didn't need saving. He needed believing, and Grace had believed in him when no one else did. Richard sat down across the table, looked at his son, and made a decision. No more experts who treated Ethan like a case. No more silence. From now on, every whisper, every word, every sound Ethan made would be fought for. He had found his voice once. Richard would never let the world take it away again. The Walters Foundation for Ethical Pediatric Care was launched with little ceremony, but with a strong purpose. Richard didn't want a big gala or media show. He just wanted it to be real. After the trial, he used his resources to do something different, something that would last. The Foundation's mission was simple: protect children from misdiagnosis, give families access to honest care, and ensure no one like Veronica could ever harm another child again. Grace agreed to be the director of outreach. It wasn't about the title, it was about the work. She didn't want to sit behind a desk. She wanted to visit clinics, speak to parents, and help rebuild the trust that had been broken. Every form, every policy, every part of the organization was built around children first. No shortcuts, no lies. The foundation didn't look like a corporate office. It looked like a home, warm walls, quiet rooms, and space for kids to just be kids. Grace's personal life changed just as much. Months after the trial ended, she received a message from her attorney. Her son, Leo, now 9 years old, wanted to meet her. Grace sat frozen with the phone in her hand, unsure if she had read it right. They arranged a supervised meeting at first, small, careful steps. Leo was shy. He didn't run into her arms. He didn't cry. He just looked at her with wide, unsure eyes and said, "Hi." That was enough. The visits grew longer, more relaxed. They drew together, played games, ate ice cream on a bench. Grace learned Leo liked space and didn't like loud noises. She noticed the way he moved, quiet and thoughtful. There were things she had missed, years she couldn't get back, but she didn't rush it. She didn't force anything. She just showed up every time, always calm, always waiting. And little by little, Leo let her in again. Slowly, carefully, he started calling her Mom. She knew he wouldn't care, but she couldn't help it. She needed it to feel safe for him. When the car pulled up, Ethan was already watching through the window. Richard stood nearby, keeping quiet. Leo stepped out, holding a sketchbook and wearing headphones. Grace met him at the door and smiled. Ethan stayed back at first, unsure. Then after a few moments, he walked over with his toy stethoscope in hand, the same one he had used with Grace so long ago. He didn't say much, but he held it out to Leo and said, "You can use it too." That was it. No big gestures. Just a quiet offer from one boy to another. Grace turned away so they wouldn't see her tears. In that small moment, two kids found something between them that no adult had to explain. It was simple, and it was real. The house slowly became something it had never been before, alive. The walls were no longer just polished wood and artwork. They were covered in finger paint, paper drawings, and sticky notes. The kitchen was often messy, with cereal on the counter and dishes in the sink. Ethan and Leo didn't always talk, but they moved together, reading, building puzzles, or sitting side by side with headphones. Grace and Richard adapted to the chaos. Instead of tight schedules, they followed rhythms. Leo liked mornings. Ethan liked quiet. Some days were smooth, some weren't. But the laughter, the messes, the little victories made everything worth it. Richard stopped reading business reports before bed. Instead, he helped Ethan with drawing exercises and memorized the boys' favorite colors. Grace stopped apologizing for the noise. This wasn't disorder. It was life, loud, unpredictable, but full of meaning. And in that life, both boys began to grow, not perfectly, not fast, but they were growing together. Outside the home, the foundation gained real traction. Clinics across the country requested consultations. Parents wrote in with stories. Some were hopeful, others heartbreaking. Grace traveled often, visiting small-town offices and major hospitals, sharing what had gone wrong and how it could be done right. Richard joined her at times, speaking not as a billionaire, but as a father who had almost lost his son to silence. Together they spoke at education conferences, medical symposiums, and even before Congress. They didn't ask for praise, they asked for change. Grace wasn't interested in becoming famous. She didn't want awards. She just wanted one thing: safety. For Ethan, for Leo, and for the thousands of children who still didn't have a voice. Every time she stood in front of a room and shared her story, she thought of the day she found the stethoscope on her chest and heard Ethan say, "I will heal you, Mummy." That was her why, and it always would be. At night, when the house was finally quiet and the lights were dim, Grace often sat near the boys' room and listened. Not because she expected to hear anything important, but because the sounds she did hear mattered. A quiet laugh, a soft question, the hum of a lullaby Leo had picked up from her. Ethan no longer screamed through the night. He no longer clawed at doors, and Leo no longer watched her from a distance. He hugged her now, told her stories, asked her to stay. Richard sometimes joined her in the hallway, sitting quietly without needing to speak. They had both lost so much. But they had built something stronger in return. Not a perfect family, but a real one. One based on patience, trust, and the courage to start again. The mansion that once echoed with silence now echoed with life. And for the first time in years, Grace didn't feel afraid of tomorrow. She was already living the future she had once only dreamed of. The gala was held in a grand hotel ballroom filled with rows of tables, crystal lights, and large banners with the Walters Foundation logo. It was a formal event organized to raise funds for pediatric mental health and ethical diagnostics. Doctors, parents, donors, and officials filled the space, dressed in suits and gowns, sipping wine and waiting for speeches. Grace stood near the side of the stage, her hands folded tightly in front of her, trying to steady her nerves. She had spoken at many events before, but this one felt different. Tonight wasn't about research or policy. Tonight, something unexpected was about to happen. From behind the curtains, Ethan stood ready, holding his toy stethoscope, the same one he had carried since the day he first spoke. He wore a small blazer, his hair combed neatly, and a pin with the foundation's logo on it. Grace's heart pounded. He had practiced this moment. But still, she wasn't sure if he'd go through with it. The lights dimmed slightly as the event host finished their introduction. "And now," they said, "someone very special has a few words to share with us." A spotlight turned to the side of the stage. For a second, Ethan didn't move. Then slowly, he walked out into the light. Cameras flashed, whispers ran through the crowd. Many guests already knew his story. Some had even read about the court trial or seen news segments about the Walters Foundation. But few had ever seen Ethan in person, and none had heard him speak publicly. He stopped center stage and looked out across the room. His hands gripped the microphone. For a brief moment it was quiet. So quiet Grace feared he had frozen. But then Ethan turned, looked at her directly, and smiled softly. His voice was gentle but clear. "This is my mommy," he said. "She healed me. Now I heal her." The room fell completely still, then gasps, then tears. Grace brought her hands to her mouth, her knees nearly buckled. She hadn't known exactly what Ethan would say, just that he had asked to speak. But hearing the words in front of so many, with all eyes watching, was more than she had imagined. There was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Confidence, clarity. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't hiding. He stood tall, holding the stethoscope across his chest like a badge. The audience slowly stood, clapping softly at first, then louder and louder. Some wiped their eyes, others held their chests. Richard, sitting in the front row, couldn't speak. He clenched the arms of his chair, blinking back tears. Years of silence, of doubt, of fear, they were gone in a single moment. This wasn't just a speech, it was a return. A child who once screamed at light and sound now stood on stage by choice, speaking with calm and pride. Grace didn't move. She only listened. Then Ethan smiled again. He looked around the room, then back at Grace, and added one more sentence, simple, honest, and unexpected. "And Daddy helps too." A ripple of laughter rolled across the room, lightening the mood, breaking the emotional tension just enough for people to breathe again. Grace turned her head to look at Richard. He had lowered his head, laughing quietly, his shoulders shaking as he tried to hold it in. When he finally looked up, his eyes were full, but joyful. He met Grace's eyes, and they both smiled. Nothing needed to be said between them. In that moment, everything was right. The applause returned, louder this time, more energized. Ethan stepped back from the microphone and walked to Grace. She bent down to hug him, but he was already reaching up. The crowd continued clapping, not for the foundation, not for the cause, but for the boy who had once been trapped and now was free. Veronica Hale's name was never mentioned that night. No one brought up the trial. No one discussed her sentencing, which was scheduled for the following week. It didn't matter anymore. The story had moved on. The public wasn't interested in a fallen expert. They were focused on what they saw on stage, a child who had come through pain, misdiagnosis, fear, and still managed to find his voice. Grace had feared for years that Ethan's silence might last forever, that she'd never hear him say the things a parent longs to hear. But he had said more than she ever expected, and he had said it when it mattered most. The media coverage the next day didn't focus on Veronica. Every headline read the same: "The boy who finally spoke." Pictures showed Ethan holding Grace's hand, waving shyly at the crowd, stethoscope still around his neck. For once, it wasn't about the damage done. It was about what came next. After the event, the mansion was quiet. The guests were gone. The staff had gone to sleep. Grace and Richard sat on the couch, still dressed from the gala, watching Ethan and Leo build a small tower with wooden blocks in the living room. It was late, but no one wanted to end the night. Grace leaned her head against Richard's shoulder. "Did that really happen?" she asked quietly. Richard nodded, placing his hand on hers. "Yes, and it was real. All of it." They watched the boys laugh softly. There were no meltdowns, no screaming, no fear, just peace. Ethan turned and looked at them, as if sensing something. He didn't speak again. He just smiled. Grace smiled back, her heart full. Richard exhaled slowly, like he was letting go of a decade of pain. For the first time, the house felt completely still in a good way. No one was running, no one was hiding, no one needed fixing. They had each other, and that was enough. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.